Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first session of the day. I hope you all are bright-eyed for our last day of WAIS. The session is Piecing the Puzzle Together, Part 1. So we'll have another later today. And starting us out today is going to be Lisa Herbert with her talk titled Glacially Derived Sediment Sources of Iron Fueling Productivity in the Amundsen Sea. Good morning, everyone.
Sorry, one second. Okay. Thanks, everyone, and thanks to the organizers for putting together a really great meeting. This has been amazing for me to come and learn about all this great science that's happening on and around the WAIS, because I come from a slightly different perspective, looking at the oceanography and biogeochemistry of adjacent oceans. And this is still quite relevant, I think, to a lot of the topics we've been hearing about, because the physics and geology and behavior of glaciers and ice sheets can really influence the chemistry and biology of adjacent seas. So I'm going to be talking about one example of this today, focused on the Amundsen Sea. So as many of you know, the Amundsen Sea receives the majority of meltwater from the WAIS through some of these fast-moving glaciers like the Pine Island Glacier and the Thwaites Glacier. This figure shows the mass loss in gigatons between 1979 and 2017. So you can see that this region where the Amundsen Sea is really receiving kind of the majority of what's coming off of all of Antarctica, actually. The Amundsen Sea is also highly productive, as shown in this figure, which is chlorophyll A content, demonstrating these very strong phytoplankton blooms that form in the polynyas during the summer. So these are open areas of water kind of sandwiched between sea ice and continental ice. And just for reference, the Pine Island Glacier is here and the Thwaites Glacier is here. Due to this productivity, the Amundsen Sea is a pretty significant carbon sink. So as the phytoplankton grow, they fix carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or the surface ocean into solid organic carbon, which can then sink and be sequestered. So this system and other high latitude systems like this can actually play a role in global carbon cycling and ultimately climate. So this is why we want to understand the productivity and what controls it in the Amundsen Sea. There's a large body of previous research that has demonstrated that productivity in the polynyas is limited primarily by light and by iron. However, the sources of iron to the polynyas are not very precisely described as of yet. So this schematic shows a representation of the ice shelf system and some potential sources or likely sources of iron. So you have a flow of circumpolar deep water down the retrograde bed at depth, and then when it reaches the grounding line, it mixes with meltwater and starts to flow out at the surface, carrying with it particulates from basal debris and end glacial debris. So this modified water mass, when it reaches the polynya, carries a mix of particulate and dissolved iron sources from the ice and the sediment. One aspect of this that we are investigating, though, is whether during the flow into the ice cavity, there is additional iron added to the circumpolar deep water from the sediments. And this has been indicated in water column data. So this is a transect published in Shirel 2015 that shows the iron concentration with depth. So if you're not used to looking at oceanographic diagrams, this is depth here, and the gray is the seabed. And each of these points represents a station. So station 60 is down here. This is actually the Dotson ice shelf, so it's slightly west of the Thwaites and Pine Island system, but it's similar. So then moving from 60, 57, 29, you're moving in this direction on the diagram. And the color indicates dissolved iron in nanomoles per kilogram. So this high concentration of dissolved iron near the seabed suggests that there is a source down there that could be modifying the water that then flows and eventually reaches the surface in this, what we call the meltwater pump, this mixing of the circumpolar deep water with meltwater and flowing out at the surface. And if you're interested in this, this was data from the Aspire cruise, the Amundsen Sea Polinia International Research Expedition. And if you're interested, there's this whole special feature in Elemento with lots of great work that was the outcome of that kind of informed my research coming in. So I'm interested in trying to quantify and really kind of identify definitively a source of iron from the sediment. This water column evidence is kind of, it shows that it's probably happening, but it's good to get, to actually identify it at the source in the sediments. So a little bit of background on the biogeochemistry of this, of how iron can actually be transported from the seabed to the water column. Typically this happens through reductive release in the sediments. So microbes in the sediment can use oxygen, just like us, to oxidize organic carbon or respire. But unlike us, if they run out of oxygen, they can switch to other oxidants like nitrate, sulfate, or metal oxides like iron oxide. And so since the source of oxygen in the sediments is the overlying water, if the downward diffusion of oxygen is overcome by the respiration rate, the consumption of oxygen, then you can end up with suboxic and ultimately sulfidic or methanic sediments. And in these sediments, you have accumulation of reduced byproducts like iron 2+, which is the aqueous form of iron. And then if this peak in iron is compressed towards the sediment surface, then you can have diffusion or mixing by organisms in the sediment. And that aqueous iron can be released into the overlying water. And I just want to point out here that in this process, manganese is also released. So you typically see dissolved manganese in suboxic sediments, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Another mechanism to get iron from the seabed into the water column is through non-reductive release. And this is an idea that's kind of underexplored so far. We see evidence of it in water column transects. This is not the Amundsen, this is actually in the Atlantic, but this is some iron isotope data that suggested that there is release of iron to the water column non-reductively, so not through that process that I just described with respiration. But this is, we're not really sure exactly how this proceeds and its importance in the global ocean overall. So in the Amundsen Sea, to identify sources and the processes controlling iron release, I looked at samples from the 2020 cruise by Thor, that's part of the International Thwaites Glacier collaboration. And I focused on two sites, one close to the Pine Island Glacier and one close to the Thwaites Glacier. And samples were very generously collected for us by Alison Lepp and Santiago Monavar in Lauren Simpkins' lab. And they took sediment cores. In this picture, you can see the core tube filled with sediment, and then using these things called rhizomes, which are essentially cylindrical filters that you insert into the sediment and then exert pressure, and you get filtered, you get the liquid component filtered out leaving the solid sediment behind. So looking at this pore water and solid sediment, we analyzed pore water trace metal content, porosity, total organic carbon, grain size, kind of a whole suite of parameters to just get a look at what's happening in the sediments. So the first thing I'll show you are our calculations of the iron fluxes, since this was our primary interest to begin with. These plots show the pore water iron concentration in nanomolar on the x-axis, and then the y-axis is increasing depth with the sediment water interface marked here at 0 on the dotted line. So we used this gradient from the uppermost sediment sample to the overlying water and the porosity and some other parameters to, and we just assumed simple Fickian diffusion, and we modeled the flux of iron across the sediment water interface to get 10.3 micromoles per meter squared per day at the Pine Island site and only 0.1 micromole per meter squared per day at the Thwaite site. So much higher flux at the Pine Island site, primarily driven by this surface peak right here. To put this in context, I just have here a plot of a compilation of iron fluxes from across the globe, plotted in relation to carbon oxidation rate on the x-axis and the bottom water oxygen content in the color of the symbols. So this is obviously focusing on the reductive release mechanisms. And if you put these two sites on the plot, the Thwaites flux, the 0.1, seems to be pretty aligned. We know that this system has high oxygen content in the overlying water, and the carbon oxidation rates are relatively low. So this fits the model quite well. But then when you add in the Pine Island site, that much higher flux, it looks a little bit more like maybe a low oxygen site should look. However, when we look at other trace metal contents like manganese, as I mentioned earlier, and cobalt and nickel, there is not really much release of these elements into the pore water at the Pine Island site. So this suggests that the sediments are oxic. And in looking at other elements, we see this strong correlation between iron and things like aluminum and titanium, which is very strange because aluminum and titanium are usually assumed to be sort of inert terrestrial sourced elements. So the fact that they're being released along with the iron suggests that there could be some kind of mineral dissolution or non-reductive release, releasing the iron at the Pine Island site and not at the Thwaite site. So we were looking for some differences between the sites, trying to identify where this iron could be coming from. And I noticed that in sampling the sediments, there were these visible large black grains in the Pine Island sediments and not in the Thwaite sediments. These also showed up in the grain size analysis. This shows grain size in microns on the x-axis and then just the frequency at the Pine Island site and the Thwaite site. And there's this shoulder around 100 to 200 microns that is not really present in the Thwaites sediments. When we looked at smear slides, this was together with Allison Lepp and Lauren Simpkins, we identified these large black grains as these very pristine, cool-looking volcanic glass shards. And this was really surprising to us. We didn't know, we weren't really looking for this, but it made sense because glass is a very amorphous mineral that dissolves fairly readily in just ambient seawater conditions. So it's possible that this glass could be dissolving in the pore water and releasing iron, aluminum, titanium, that whole suite of elements. And we don't know exactly where this glass came from. There's been some evidence of active volcanism beneath the Pine Island Glacier, and maybe some of you here know better than me where this might be coming from, and I'd be happy to chat with anyone who's interested, but we don't know if this is like a modern eruption or an ancient eruption that was frozen into the ice, but we're trying to think about that and figure it out. So to compare the glass to the pore water composition, this is a way to demonstrate that the iron in the pore water may be coming directly from the glass. We looked at the chemical composition of the glass using SEM EDS. This is an SEM image of a glass shard. And based on the ratios of iron to aluminum titanium in the pore water, there's actually Slightly different ratios for iron to aluminum. So this is just a plot of aluminum concentrations and iron concentrations on the y-axis in the pore water, indicated by the squares, the purple squares, and then in the glass, just based on the ratio of the EDS data. So the glass is slightly lower ratio than in the pore water, and same for titanium, although the titanium fits much better if you just remove this outlier in the pore water. So, and just of note, the glass seems to be similar to a basalt or a mafic mineral rather than a felsic glass like obsidian. So this suggests that the glass could very well be the source, and I think it's likely that the small differences in ratio is due to reactions in the pore water after release, such as the aluminum could stick to the particles, for example, and be stripped out of the pore water much faster than the iron. So overall, there is likely a benthic flux into the water column in the Amundsen, and this could, in fact, have an influence on productivity. But this is spatially variable, and it also seems that the processes vary across the Amundsen Sea, with some of this non-reductive release occurring in regions, and this could be very important. So, and this study is also exciting because even outside of the Amundsen, it suggests that non-reductive release mechanisms could be important as a global source of iron to the ocean, so that's exciting. And we have some analyses underway. Iron isotopes will be incorporating these values into a biogeophysical model to test our assumptions, and we have an upcoming cruise, so we will collect more samples and see if we can constrain some of this variability. But thank you for your time, and I will be happy to chat about this during the question session.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa. Next, we'll have Mike Dinniman. He'll be giving a talk on the sensitivity of the relationship between Antarctic ice shelves and iron supply to projected changes in the atmospheric forcing.
Thanks. Well, good morning, everyone. Like Tasha said, I'm going to talk about some possible changes in the relationship between ice shelves and the supply of dissolved iron to the surface waters around Antarctica. Lisa already nicely talked about this, but around Antarctica, phytoplankton production is primarily controlled by either light limitation or micronutrient limitation. And the micronutrient that everybody worries about is dissolved iron. Now, there was some earlier work in the Amundsen Sea polynya where they looked at the contributions of ice shelves. And they found that it wasn't so much the direct meltwater from the ice shelf itself, but it was actually an overturning circulation driven by the meltwater that forced deep sources of iron, say circumpolar deep water and sediment sources, into the surface waters. And that was actually more important. Ken talked yesterday about overturning due to meltwater in glacial fjords. And you can get the same kind of overturning in underneath ice shelf cavities. Now, we did some work looking at this around all of Antarctica. And to do that, we have a circumantarctic model. The plot here is not showing the entire model domain, but it's just a blow-up of Antarctica. It's a 5-kilometer resolution ocean circulation model. We have sea ice in it, we have ice shelves in it, and we have 14 tracers in there, just representing different possible sources of iron. 8 of the tracers are different sectors of ice shelf meltwater. And so my reading glasses so I can see on this. So well, I don't need a cursor. The black areas are just the ice shelves in the model, and the black boxes are the different sectors, so we can keep track of where the ice shelf meltwater is coming from. Then we had 2 sediment tracers, one of which we forced to 0 inside the ice shelf cavity, so we could keep track of what the ice shelf overturning circulation was doing to that particular tracer. Then we had 2 CDW tracers, one of which we forced to 0 in the ice shelf cavities, and 2 sea ice melt tracers. And I should note, for the glacial meltwater, we just have it from the floating ice. We don't have anything from subglacial hydrology in this. Now, the plot on the left is just showing the model total dissolved iron in the surface layer over the open portions of the continental shelf, right before a bloom, so not underneath an ice shelf cavity. And then we don't have dissolved iron measurements all around Antarctica, but we do have satellites, and they can see ocean color. And so the plot in the center is a climatology of chlorophyll A over several summers. And if you squint hard enough, you can actually see a correlation between where the model says there should be a lot of iron and where the satellite says there's a lot of chlorophyll. Like if you look in the Ross Sea and the Amundsen Sea, you can see there's high iron in the model and there's high chlorophyll in satellite obs. If you look around a lot of East Antarctica, it's low iron except for Pridd's Bay. Same thing with the chlorophyll, low chlorophyll except for Pridd's Bay. I can talk about the Weddell Sea. Oh no, actually Weddell Sea is fine in this. And then when we look at the details of how important the overturning is, about a third of the total dissolved iron supply to the surface water is actually due to ice shelf melt forced overturning. The plot on the right it's basically just a ratio showing where the ice shelves matter. And you can see it's quite heterogeneous. The ice shelves matter a lot, say in the Amundsen and the Bellingshausen Sea where it's quite red. You would expect that. Those are areas where you can't get direct 1D mixing from deep sources of iron. It's not a high salinity shelf water formation region, but you have a lot of melt in ice shelf cavities. You have a lot of overturning in the ice shelf cavities. Along a lot of East Antarctica and the Ross Sea, the ice shelves don't matter as much. And then here in the Weddell, they actually do matter, which I didn't expect at first, and I can talk about that later. Oh, and I should note, between the plot on the left and the plot in the center, we actually do look at this more quantitatively, the correlations in the paper. So the new stuff we've been working on now is we've been forcing a model with idealized changes to atmospheric forcing. And these changes are based on CMIT-5 projections out to 2100. And the numbers here are mostly from high emission scenario cases. So we didn't downscale a particular CMIT-5 model or a mean CMIT-5. We just add idealized changes in order so we could see which might be more important. So we ran a base simulation from before. Then we ran a case where we increased the strength of the westerlies and we shifted them poleward. Then we ran a case where we included an increase in the precipitation on top of the wind changes. And then we ran a case where we bumped up the air temperature by 2.5 degrees on top of all the other things. And if we just change the winds, don't make any other changes, we actually increased ice shelf basal melt by 50%. That was the biggest change of all the incremental changes. If we add some precipitation, that doesn't really change the ice shelf melt much at all. And then if we increase the air temperatures, that bumps up the melt by about 300 gigatons per year. What the plot is showing is where these changes occur. It's just a ratio of the mean ice shelf basal melt with all the atmospheric changes to the base case. And you can see that pretty much everywhere it's quite red, except for the large cold water ice shelves. There's not as big a change, say, in Ronnie Filch nor in Ross, and probably Amory. Now, what this plot is showing, it's a time history of the average dissolved iron concentration from the different sources in the surface layer of the model over the open portions of the continental shelf. The solid lines are when we make all the changes to the atmospheric forcing. The dashed lines are for the base case. And you can see, well, first of all, you can see the time history of how iron gets into the surface waters. You go fall in the winter and the spring, physics builds everything up except for the green, which is the ice shelf melt. That actually gets released once the sea ice melt is the green. Once the sea ice starts melting, once you get into late spring and summer. Then you get in the late spring, the lights come on, everything blooms, it's all pretty, and biology starts uptaking the dissolved iron. Now, if you look at the difference between the solid lines and the dashed lines, you can see the increase in the different components. And when we make all the changes, we get a 62% increase in the total dissolved iron supply. And the largest change is due to the sediment supply, the beige lines. But you can see that all the components increase. The plot on the right is showing where the increase happens. So it's the ratio of the surface dissolved iron when you add all the atmospheric changes. And the net change is pretty much positive everywhere except for the western Weddell shelf and the Ross shelf. Now, the ice shelf cavity contribution increases too, but increases by 49%, which is actually a little less than the total increase. And so the portion of dissolved iron supply due to the ice shelf cavities actually decreases a bit. These two plots are again showing that ratio of basically where the ice shelves matter. The plot on the left is just showing the base case, and the one on the right is when we make all atmospheric forcing changes. And if you first look at it, there's not a lot of difference. But if you look at it in more detail, the reds are a little more redder, like if you look in the Amundsen and the Bellingshausen. If you look along East Antarctica, the blues are bluer. So it's becoming even more heterogeneous. And so, like I said, in the mean, the ice shelf related fraction actually decreases a little bit, but in some areas it actually increases, like the Amundsen and the Bellingshausen. Now, all these changes are talking about dissolved iron limitation, or dissolved iron supply rather, but the light limitation matters too. And the two figures on here are just showing the model summer sea ice concentrations. And you can see when you make all the atmospheric forcing changes, unsurprisingly, there's less sea ice, especially in the Weddell Sea and along a lot of East Antarctica. And then something else that matters for light limitations for phytoplankton growth is the depth of the surface mix layer. The surface mix layer is shallower. Phytoplankton are more towards the surface for more of their life history. They can see more light. And so when we first just incrementally added the winds, we actually deepened the surface mix layer. But if we added some more precipitation, the surface mix layer showed a little bit. And then if we added an increase in temperature on top of that, the net change is actually decrease in the surface mix layer depth. So just to wrap it up, all these projected changes in the atmosphere lead to an 83% increase in the total Antarctic ice shelf melt. That's not really a super new result. Caitlin Naughton did some similar experiments where she took some projected CMIP5 atmospheric changes and forced the model she had, and she got about a 90% increase. But what's new here is the incremental way we did it, and so we can say that more of the rise in the ice shelf melt is actually due to the changes in the winds rather than, say, changes in precipitation or changes in the atmospheric temperature. The importance of the melt-driven overturning for nutrient supply increases in some areas, like the Amundsen and Bellingshausen, but it actually slightly decreases in the mean. And then the atmospheric changes lead to more open water in summer, they lead to shallower mixed layers, and they lead to significantly more dissolved iron supplied to the surface. So all three of these point in the same direction in terms of reducing some of the limitations on primary production. And so maybe this points towards there could be more primary production if all these predicted changes out to 2100 happen. And then lastly, there's a lot of iron sources we don't have in this model. And I can make hand-wavy arguments why some of them don't matter in the mean. They may matter in certain specific places. But the one that I can't hand-wave away is the subglacial supply of dissolved iron. There's been some hard-earned measurements now in some subglacial lakes about how much dissolved iron is in there, and it's an awful lot. The concentrations are really high. And so how much of this gets into subglacial hydrology, gets out in the ice shelf cavities, and gets out in the open ocean is a big open question that we're starting to think about. And if anyone has any suggestions on what to do about this, I'm more than happy to listen. And finally, thanks to NSF for support.
Thank you, Mike. All right, we're going to bring up the next speaker is Asmara Lehrmann. And she is a student, so definitely get onto your forms and make sure to fill those out for her. And her talk is going to be about
My name is Asmara Lehrmann, and I am a PhD.
Tracking circumpolar deep water, Foraminifera as a proxy for oceanic conditions offshore Thwaites Glacier, Antarctica.
Good morning. My name is Asmara Lehrmann, and I am a PhD student at the University of Alabama Department of Geological Sciences. I am a member of the Thwaites Offshore Research Team in the International Thwaites Glacier Collaboration. Today, I will share with you some results of Foraminifera assemblages offshore Thwaites Glacier. Our role in Thwaites Offshore Research, or THOR, in the International Thwaites Glacier Collaboration is to provide the historical context of the marine part of the Thwaites Glacier system. As Molly Patterson said on the first day of the workshop, we need the paleo record in order to better understand the dynamics of the whole system. We are looking at the record in the Holocene with a resolution that spans on the decadal to the millennial scale. With this historical context, we hope to help aid our colleagues in the modeling portion of the International Thwaites Glacier Collaboration to better forward model the future of Thwaites Glacier. Thor studies the paleo record by looking at both the sedimentary record and the geophysical record. In this schematic created by Dr. Becky Manzoni, you can see the many ways that Thor collects our data. Check out Dr. Kelly Hogan's paper in the cryosphere on Thwaites Glacier bathymetry, which was collected from the Palmer using a sub-bottom profiler. Take note of the troughs that act as conduits for circumpolar deep water, which we will be talking about later. In the sedimentary record, which we collected both from the Palmer and from the ice shelf with a hot water drill, we are looking at the many controls of glacial stability, such as subglacial meltwater, the interaction of water masses, such as circumpolar deep water, former pinning points and grounding lines, and even atmospheric conditions. To learn more about the facies of these cores, please check out Rachel Clark's in-person poster. We use multi-proxy analysis on the sedimentary record. Each of our team members are tackling a different proxy to evaluate different parts of the system. Proxies include grain size and shape, Foraminifera, diatoms, stable isotopes, trace metals, beryllium-10, pore water, provenance, and biomarkers. These proxies work together to provide a holistic and robust paleo context. The role that the University of Alabama plays is on the ecological side, and I am looking at the assemblages of Foraminifera. Foraminifera, or forams, are single-celled organisms that live on the seafloor, with the exception of one species in the Southern Ocean that lives in the water column. Foram communities are sensitive to their habitats, including salinity, temperature, water depth, sediment type, and available nutrients. We were able to collect foram surface samples along with in situ conductivity temperature depth, or CTD, data from these locations. We stained the surface sediment samples with rose bengal to indicate which of the forams were alive at the time of collection. By doing so, we will be able to see for the first time the communities of Foraminifera on the seafloor of the Amundsen Sea. Why are we collecting seafloor sediments, the modern seafloor sediments, when we were aiming to provide a historical context? We need to establish the modern Foraminifera populations to help us interpret the paleo assemblages. Here's a rough schematic on the cores immediately offshore Thwaites Glacier, annotated with notes on the Foraminifera I counted for radiocarbon. Here in the boxes are areas where I was able to pick Foraminifera. But what do they mean? What do these populations and these trends that I saw as I picked for radiocarbon indicate? The modern population of Foraminifera will help us interpret these paleo assemblages. Here is the bathymetric map of the Amundsen Sea from Dr. Kelly Hogan's paper. The bathymetry gets deeper as the shade of blue gets darker. Here you can see how the troughs act as conduits for the circumpolar deep water. Today I will be showing you principal component analyses on the living and dead Foraminifera assemblages from these 4 locations. BC28 is in Cranton Bay, and it has a cooler water mass. MC26 is in between Pine Island Ice Shelf and Eastern Thwaites Ice Shelf. MC14 is offshore the Thwaites Glacier tongue, and MC16 is sitting on the H1 high. Good morning. My name is Asmara Lehrmann, and I am a PhD student. Here is the preliminary principal component analysis of these 4 samples. Axis 1 has the most variability, with an eigenvalue of 0.7. Axis 2 has the second most variability, with an eigenvalue of about 0.2. Each of these vectors indicate a different Foraminifera species or genus when the species could not confidently be determined. The main control on variability is composition. There are 2 types of Foraminifera. One builds its test with the sediment in its habitat, which is agglutinated. The other type is the calcareous Foraminifera, which use the water's carbonate to build their tests. This composition could be based on the availability of calcium carbonate in the water mass. The next control on axis 2 might be water mass. To me, it is quite compelling that Neogloboquadrina pachyderma and Bulimina aculeata are grouped here because they indicated advection of circumpolar deep water at the Cosgrove ice shelf in this paper. Likewise, our end-member samples from Cranton Bay had a high concentration of pergo, which could indicate the end member of the cold shelf water. Okay, so I've added some blue circles to represent the Foraminifera samples and their living and dead assemblages. BC28 is over here in an area in Cranton Bay where there's a cool water mass, which is reflected on the PCA over here. Now I'm going to zoom into the Thwaites Glacier area with a map from Vollen et al. 2021. You can see that MC16 is right in the path of the inflow of circumpolar deep water, which is plotted right over here on the PCA. Look at MC26. It is getting modified circumpolar deep water flowing from the Pine Island ice shelf, and look where it plots on the PCA over here. Check out MC14. It is between the inflow and outflow, which probably indicates modified circumpolar deep water, which is also plotting over by MC26 on the PCA. Mud layers are storytellers. The biota that are preserved in these mud layers have revealed that this is not the first time in the Munson Sea that ice shelves have melted from below. Neogloboquadrina pachyderma were advected below the Cosgrove ice shelf, along with the circumpolar deep water mass, which helped influence the retreat of the Cosgrove ice shelf. To wrap it up, I want to remind everyone that I will be using these modern foraminifera populations to help us interpret paleoassemblages. Like at Cosgrove Ice Shelf, it is imperative for us to understand the mechanisms that influence the stability of Thwaites Glacier in the past to help inform our modelers to forward model what's going on at Thwaites Glacier. Thank you so much for making the time to come to my talk, and thank you to the steering committee for making it possible for me to share virtually. I really appreciate this hybrid format. Here is my contact information. I look forward to your questions at the panel.
Great, and just another reminder to fill out the student award form for Asmara. Next, we'll have Alex Hager, who will be talking about stable channelized subglacial drainage modeled beneath Thwaites Glacier, West Antarctica.
Good morning. My name is Alex Hager. I am also a PhD student working at University of Oregon. And I'll be sharing some work that I've been doing with Los Alamos National Laboratory, modeling subglacial drainage beneath Thwaites Glacier. The question we're trying to answer is whether or not it's possible to form persistent subglacial channels beneath Thwaites Glacier and what impact this might have on ice dynamics. There's been kind of a conventional paradigm historically that subglacial channels in this context, I'm referring to Roethlisberger channels that melt upward to the overlying ice through dissipative melting. But this type of channelization can't actually occur underneath Antarctic ice sheets because of the lack of significant surface melt and because of the shallow hydropotential gradients of the ice sheets. But this assumption has started to get challenged in the last few years or decade based on some observations and modeling efforts. But this could be important to Thwaites Glacier because basal friction and submarine melt are important controls to the retreat of Thwaites Glacier. And if subglacial channels were to exist under Thwaites, you'd expect for them to influence both basal friction and submarine melt. Yet there's not really an observational consensus on whether or not it's possible to form stable channels beneath Thwaites or if they exist. So we are trying to answer this question using the subglacial hydrology component of the Mali land ice model, which was developed at the DOE. But we run into an issue which is common in subglacial hydrology models, particularly in Antarctica, where it's really hard to validate these models for large tidewater glaciers with ice shelves. And this kind of leads to the scenario where it's fairly possible to just tune your model to get the desired effect. So we're trying to get around this issue by running over 110 different simulations of Thwaites Glacier drainage, spanning a range of realistic parameters for our four main conductivity and bed roughness parameters. From there, we're going to narrow that range of 110 simulations by trying to find which ones could be possible representations of reality. We have a few different criteria that we're going to use to do that. The main one is that last one that I have in bold there, which is correspondence to the radar specularity content. And that is measured from the Schroeder 2013 paper. And then finally, we're going to compare these to ice shelf basal melt rates at the end, just to make sure, as a double check, that our model is doing something appropriate. So we're using radar specularity content to validate our model because it is an indicator of spatially extensive water-saturated conditions at the bed. Where a high specularity content would mean that you have water-saturated flat surfaces that can reflect radar energy, whereas if you have low specularity content, that means that the bed doesn't really have much water in that particular place, or the concave shape of that channel is reflecting radar energy and scattering it in diminishing returns. So we're comparing our observations with our model by creating binary masks, here shown in black up there, of places where we have high specular content from, again, the Schroeder 2013 paper. And then we have a field in our model which predicts where these highly saturated regions in the bed are. And we are trying to select for runs that look something like this, that share a similar shape to what we see in the specularity content. And we're trying to weed out runs that might look like this, or oversaturated even more like that, or runs where we just don't see any oversaturated areas in the bed. So we end up coming away, well, I should say that we also reran this parameterization, or the parameter sweep, with the ability to form channels disabled, so no channels were allowed to develop. We were unable to reproduce the observed specularity content in any of those runs. So that kind of gives us some evidence that these channels might be important. So we came away with about 15 different simulations which we deemed possibly realistic. And I'll share some results from those. So starting here is box plots at every 50 kilometers from the grounding line being on the left there. And this is just the discharge in the distributed system. You can see that it kind of slowly increases towards the grounding line, except once you get in the last 50 meters from the grounding line, it drops off rather drastically. If we look at the discharge in the channelized system, we see a very different pattern where the discharge actually increases pretty much exponentially towards the grounding line. By the time we get to the grounding line, all of our realistic runs had channelized discharges that were greater than the distributed system. We can even look at the maximum discharge, or the discharge of the largest channel at each given transect. And about 200 kilometers from the grounding line, these are fairly insignificant, but by the time we get to the grounding line, the largest channel has an average discharge of about 80 cubic meters a second. So what do these channels actually look like? Up here is an average, a grid cell average of all of our simulations, with the background color being effective pressure, and that branching structure is the channel. And for context, those black contours up there are the 50-kilometer transects that I just showed you in the previous slide. And as you can see, there actually aren't that many channels. At any given transect, there's only about 1 to 3 channels that cross each transect. But they're able to actually evacuate water fairly efficiently from the entire domain, which I'll show you in the next slide. If we look at this inset down here, which is just a zoom in at the grounding line, you'll see that those channels converge at the grounding line and enter the ocean right at the zone where we see the highest ice shelf basal melt rates, as measured by ADUSIMILE 2018. And we reran one of these runs, one of our realistic runs, at a higher resolution just to test to see if this is sensitive to resolution. And in fact, all of our discharges at each of those transects are pretty much identical. Except for at the grounding line, the one main difference here is that those 2 main channels enter the ocean independently, about 20 kilometers apart, but they do also both enter the ocean where we see high basal melt rates. So this suggests that these channels are probably contributing to submarine melt through the formation of subglacial discharge plumes at the terminus, which could then run underneath the ice shelf. We can also look at the impacts of these channels on effective pressure by, again, comparing these, the effective pressure to the distributed only runs where the channels were disabled. So here in purple is the effective pressures for all of our realistic runs in the channel-enabled scenarios along a centerline transect of the glacier. And in gray is the same transect and effective pressures for just the distributed-only runs. Particularly important is the nearest 50 kilometers to the grounding line, where the effective pressures in the channel-enabled runs are about 3 times greater than the distributed-only runs. So this suggests that the channels are really evacuating a lot of water, despite there only being really 2 channels in this area. They're able to draw water from the across the entire glacier width and remove that water and increase basal friction. So they could actually be somewhat stabilizing force against retreat, despite increasing submarine melt rates at the grounding line. So the last thing I'll finish on is probably of interest to maybe large-scale ice sheet modelers, and it's this blue line that you can see right at the grounding line. And that is if we assume the perfect hydrostatic connection to the ocean, which is how a lot of ice sheet modelers parameterize effective pressure. And we can see that it does a decent job of capturing what the channel-enabled effective pressures do within 5 kilometers of the grounding line. But if we add another axis here, and notice that it's a different scale in the upper box, it actually overestimates effective pressures by up to an order of magnitude farther inland. So this is an indicator that perhaps this is something that we should reevaluate as a parameterization for effective pressure, and we should maybe start incorporating subglacial hydrology into our long-term projections. So in summary, our model does suggest that these subglacial channels are possible to form and likely do form under Thwaites Glacier, and that they affect the submarine melting and effective pressures under the glacier and could greatly influence the retreat into the future. I have a few other points there that I didn't get to, but I'm free to answer questions about them during the discussion. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Alex. Next, we're going to have a talk from Robin Bell. She's going to be talking about insights from Thwaites and IPY on building large collaborative international programs. Oh, yeah. Oh, just right here. Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Hello, my name is Robin Bell. I'm a Lamont research professor at Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University. And first, I'd like to thank the organizers for allowing us to have a real vibrant hybrid meeting. When I thought about where we are in terms of our science and what I'd like to share with the community, I thought that it would be useful to share insights from building my experience in helping form both the IPY and the Thwaites programs, because I think people in this room are going to have a chance to launch large programs soon themselves. So why is this a unique moment? This is a unique moment for both glaciology and climate science because our science is needed more now than ever. We're getting better at connecting the process of science with the community's governance and companies and other entities that need the knowledge we produce. Science budgets and funding opportunities are likely to increase and are increasing now. And this is not a competition, but I like to think of this as a chance to increase the support to our entire community. Things like the science and technology centers like CRESIS and now the oldest and OMG in Greenland. Those are net wins, and Icebridge are all net wins to our community, bringing new resources and new people and new data to the table. So I'm going to tell you 2 quick stories in the sort of 8 minutes I have. One is they're both focusing on the role the National Academy's Polar Research Board has played in developing plans and fundamentally helping to increase funding. And I've had the honor to be involved with both of them. And so we'll start with the International Polar Year, 2007, 2009. Some of you may have participated, some of you may just be aware that it happened in 2007 to 2009. From 1997 to 2001, there were some interesting international rumblings. about the concept of should there be an international polar year. Some serious engagement in Russia, but primarily focused on having a celebration to celebrate 50 years since the IGY. I was currently chairing the Polar Research Board, and we convened a brainstorming session in 2002 to look at how the last polar year came into being and to look at framing questions and really to address the question of, should we actually work on having an international polar year, and was it worth our community's time? Who's advocating the ideas? You'll recognize some of them. They're grassroots individual scientists, everybody from Sridhar and Bob Long, key members of the WAIS community, Ken Jessic or Heinz Miller, all were advocating it. The European Research Board was thinking about it, and ICSU began to start thinking about it. So after that PRB planning meeting, we actually managed to spin off very quickly. It was between November and January. We spun off a planning group through ICSU, the International Council of Scientific Unions, that you can see is very international, and really began to move forward with putting in place a process to allow the community to engage and build with an international polar year. I'm not going to talk about the international process too much, although we did identify themes very quickly about the environmental status, change in the poles, the connections between the poles and globals, unknowns in the frontiers of science, using the unique vantage point of the poles to look at observations of other systems, and then for the first time actually bringing in cultural, historical, and social processes into the science. The Academy at the same time put together a planning committee that Mary Albert led. You'll recognize a number of people again here you'll know from the WAIS community. But it was very unusual because the Academy actually put funds on the table to help with this planning process. We developed a report that Mary Albert wrote. We brought together the agencies, and the remarkable thing is it really did bring in new funding and new opportunities for science. There was testimony in front of the House and the Senate, the head of NSF, the head of ARCIS, Kelly Miller, who was an oceanographer, not head of OPP, and former head of the Polar Research Board, and myself and Mark McCaffrey all testified, pointing out about the new infusion of funding into science that was emerging from the polar year planning. What happened in the long run? In the long run, there was increased funding for polar science around the globe. 60 countries were involved, 50,000 scientists and educators mobilized. There was a new framing for international collaboration. PolNet, as you'll hear later from Terry Wilson, was started. There were discoveries in the north and south. There were new data compilations. Eric Rigno led the satellite velocity compilation, and APEX that many of our early career scientists may be aware of was founded. So what did I gain from this service? I mean, it's very interesting to think, why should I do this? It was a creative opportunity, everything from logo design to scientific direction. I actually got to, my idea for the logo, which I scribbled on a coffee cup, ended up being the heart of what was used, that person with the reaching to both poles with a link in between. I got to broaden my networks, and I really had an opportunity to foster change. I really like to think that I was able to make sure that we step forward in terms of showing that the future face of polar science had to be more diverse. Here's Adrian Smith, a graduate student who was working with me at that point, helping with the inaugural ceremonial opening of the cake, of the International Polar Year with a cake, with a Russian scientist who'd actually participated. And Adrian and I and Beth, shown here in this picture, actually got to do some pretty cool science with 7 other nations and go to the top of the Antarctic ice sheet. So just quickly, I just wanted to leave you with a sense of how did the Thwaites project start. It again started with a study where the community set priorities through an NSF-funded study that the Polar Research Board launched. It went from the committee, and you can see the committee was there. I co-chaired it with Bob Weller from Woods Hole. We did a many post-its, talked to the community, figured out what the community wanted, and then we ended up with a report on where NSF should invest funding in Antarctic and Southern Ocean research. And the number one priority really was how fast, how much will the sea level rise, and focusing on the Thwaites sector of West Antarctica. At the same time, BASS was developing a plan led by David Vaughan, and there were following on meetings. There was a Boulder planning meeting that resulted in the Scambos and Bell et al. 2017 document. And there was a meeting in London that brought together NSF, NERC, and the Royal Academy in 2016. And one of the things that strikes me on reflecting is how much better we are at hybrid meetings and people can actually participate. Looking forward, the same community tools are now going to be available for building work in Wilkes Land in East Antarctica. And there will be an opportunity on the table for an IPY on some version in 2032. The previous polar years took 7 to 8 years to plan. So can't hurt to sort of put that in the back of your mind as something that might be emerging in the future. The previous polar years took 7 to 8 years to plan. So might be time to start planning sometime. So thank you very much. And thanks to the organizers.
We're gonna have a quick message from Kirsty Tinto to add on to that.
Thank you. This is just the perfect opportunity because there was a logo on the last of Robin's slides, and I wanted to speak up for this SCAR action group of Antarctic Rings. This is one of those grassroots fledgling community building endeavors to try and figure out how to get an observational strategy for the grounding line of Antarctica. So collaborating internationally under the SCAR auspices, an action group is a 2-year program where we're really trying to scope out the problem and figure out what resources we have. The primary target is to complete reference topography on the ice sheet and the margin. The rings idea is 1, to constrain ice sheet change and grounding zone processes, 1, to go seaward of that and capture bathymetry and ice-ocean interactions, and 1 landward to look at the evolution of the future ice sheet. It's an action group that's existed since March of this year, and the goal is to find out where the important knowledge gaps are. So we really want to kind of engage modelers and people who are using these data, as well as observers who can go out and gather new data. These are a representation of some of the people who have joined into the action group and are talking about this problem already. There's going to hopefully be a workshop sometime next year, and if anybody is interested in being involved, Kenny Matsuoka in Norway is the email that you should write to or check out the website there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kirsty, sorry. Next, we're going to have Ted Scambos coming up to talk about the Thwaites Glacier research at the midpoint of ITGC.
Hi, thanks, Tasha. Thanks, organizers. This is really a very good hybrid meeting, and I think we're, as Robin said, getting our feet under us as to how to organize this. Further back? Outside. Can I stand in the back? Pardon me? Can you step closer to the microphone? Yes. Wasn't that the cause of the... Okay. Great. So David Vaughan started the slide deck. It's much longer than what I'll show you because even with 1 slide per paper, I think it would take a couple of hours now to go through all of the good papers that have come out as part of the Thwaites program. And I want to thank the funders as well. You can go to the next slide, I guess. Do I do it here? The 3 key findings so far for the Thwaites effort really are what I'm calling the last mile, which is details of how the modified circumpolar deep water actually gets to the ice front, has to do with boundary conditions and measurements of the ocean flow and ocean salinity and temperature. The other ones are the grounding line and pinning point retreat. We're getting into more details as to exactly how that process goes on right at the point of contact between the ice and the bed. And then also getting ice cliffs right. I think that's actually a major contribution from both Anna Crawford and Doug Ben, and especially a recent paper by Jeremy Basis that shows that while ice cliffs happen, it's tough to sustain them. There's a lot of complexity into exactly what the styles of calving are in an ice cliff or a high ice front situation. And modeling that through the Thwaites retreat is going to be complicated, detailed, and it'll have a lot of fits and starts, I think. You've already seen this graphic from Asmara. In fact, she gave several of the slides that I'll show you, so I'll definitely give her a rating for student presentations on jumping the gun on my presentation. But anyway, she did a fantastic job. But basically what you can see is that from the start, the ITGC was designed to be interdisciplinary and feed process studies and past history studies into modeling studies, both on processes, which is sort of the focus of Dominoes. That's an ice cliff focused grant. And then Profit, which is intended to be more of a forecasting study of how exactly Thwaites will unfold over the next few centuries. Ghost and Time are both studying upstream a little bit, and their fieldwork has been delayed somewhat. However, the ice-bed interaction and the shear margin interaction will be the focus there. And then Melt and Tarzan are actually well underway and have one big field season left for each of them, and they'll be getting out quite a few results in the near future. So it's tough with the mask. One of the things I wanted to emphasize in the beginning is what we think the initial causality is for the retreat of Thwaites Glacier. Basically, why is Thwaites Glacier retreating now? And there was a nice study that actually David Holland was invited to contribute that outlined the wind patterns that have changed as a result of warming in the tropics and faster westerly winds around Antarctica that lead to raising the level, the thermocline level between polar water and circumpolar deep water underneath. By raising that thermocline, you're allowing warm water to get onto the continental shelf, as is shown in this lower right graphic, and get in towards the grounding line and begin to melt the underside of the ice sheet. And there are several previous studies that built upon that, built up that idea, basically. One of the first things that ITGC did was conduct a large aerogeophysical survey of basically the grounding line area, focused on the grounding line area, but also extending to all of the field sites that would be visited by the various field teams. Using the gravity data from that, we got a better mapping of what the topography looked like underneath the ice shelves. That allowed us to talk a little bit more detail about both ungrounding and about ocean flow in those areas. You've also seen this graphic before. Asmara showed it, that showed some of the new multi-beam sonar scanning that we did in the vicinity of Thwaites Ice Tongue and Thwaites Ice Shelf, the remnant outlets for the glacier. Part of this was accessible for the first time because the Thwaites Ice Tongue broke apart in the years just prior to the cruise and allowed this detailed mapping. So again, this last mile study of how the water gets both onto the continental shelf and then exactly how it follows the seabed to the ice front has been an interesting and kind of a comprehensive, multifaceted result from ITGC so far. Anna Vollen did this study on the oceanography that was measured by the crews that did the bathymetric mapping as well. And what we're seeing is that the inflow underneath the Thwaites ice shelf actually comes from Pine Island, and there's a signature to this water that's slightly less salty than what we're calling the Thwaites water, which comes more directly to the main channel of Thwaites. And that Pine Island signature for the seawater is confirmed by the 2 Amigos stations that are located on the ice shelf, as well as the flow direction, the general flow direction of this deepest layer of water is confirmed by the 2 stations that we have with sensors that are underneath the ice shelf, hanging in the ocean layer, and measuring both current direction and salinity. So basically we're getting an idea of the circulation. These 2 different channels have slightly different seawater signatures. They also have probably different pulsing or different arrangements of the climate patterns that feed circumpolar deep water into them. So we'll be unfolding that a little bit more in the future with the next cruise. I wanted to talk about some of the grounding line work, although there's many slides that could have been contributed here from the MELT study. Brittany Schmidt has done a lot of work with the ice fin underwater robot. And this study here, based on elevation changes, showed a region they're calling the butterfly that thinned very rapidly in the recent past. Melillo et al. Did a nice study of this using INSAR. This is a study using, I believe, tandem X DEMs and ISAT-2. On the ice cliff study, this nice summary from Anna Crawford showed that there's a whole lot of different styles of calving. There's not just one sort of ice cliff catastrophe that occurs. There's a whole variety of forms and patterns that occur as you get to a tall ice cliff with a submerged but lightly grounded glacier. That bulging at the waterline is one indication, and also the several stair-step features. And what we've noticed right away, and I'd like to pursue this personally some more with Naomi Aquat, a new PhD student, is that several of the glaciers in the Larsen B area showed surface features that look very reminiscent of what the modeling studies show are typical for these various high ice cliff calving mechanisms shortly after the breakup of the Larsen B. Jeremy Bass has carried this quite a lot further and actually really got into some of the details of these various methods given different water depths and cliff heights. And you can see some of that here in this left-hand graphic with both a cliff resting on dry land and then a relatively thinner ice layer with a high ice cliff and then a very deep water glacier. And in the right side, you can see that Thwaites is actually in the stable retreat model that he has and not quite in the runaway situation that he forecast. There's some quick videos here of this shallower runaway situation that breaks apart very quickly. That's just 21 days, 22 days, whereas this other system, much thicker ice, has first a listric fault at the top, then you have uncompensated bench of ice underneath that then lifts off the seabed and breaks away. But that pattern is relatively steady state, or a stable form of retreat rather than a runaway retreat, as the upper graphic shows. And I just want to show that Crane Glacier exhibits some of these features. The earlier image that I showed was Hectoria, just to the north of this in the Larsen B. And what you can see there is that there's an area that's sort of scooped out right at the front. It looks like the listric fault sort of failure. And then the large flat area there is one of these full thickness icebergs that's risen up from the bottom and is beginning to float away. Thanks very much. And once again, a nice West Antarctic ice sheet meeting.
Great, thank you, Ted. I want to invite all of our speakers that are in person up to the front. So we're going to have a discussion, and I'd like to have another round of applause for everybody who gave amazing talks this morning. And just as a recap, Lisa talked about iron processes measured within the water column. Mike talked about modeling iron. Asmara talked about Foraminifera proxy for oceanic conditions. Alex talked about modeling subglacial drainage. Robin talked about large collaborative international programs, and Ted did as well, talking about ITGC. So to start y'all out, since we talked a lot about our large collaborative groups that we have within the community, I wanted to ask what any of the speakers thought would be the most important contributions that we as a community or might be able to do at the moment to advance our understanding of WAIS as a community in meetings or in skills and that sort of thing to move things forward in the future. That's definitely directed a little bit more towards Ted and Robin, but.
I'll leap in if when.
Go ahead, Robin.
Okay, thanks, Ted. I think, it might be incumbent on the WAIS community to start thinking about writing sort of the next gen science plan. Just beginning to maybe frame out what the next priorities with, maybe working with people like the Rings group, so that it's a framework and to move forward with.
Okay. Yeah, I agree, Robin. Your talk, the comment that I was going to put in the chat basically is that, as Robin pointed out, it takes a long time to get some of these larger initiatives and new ideas rolling and funded. It can feel often when you're writing proposals that you're reacting to whatever NSF has put before us as a challenge, but with organizations like Polar Research Board and SCAR, you can actually steer the science by having a community input and consensus about what the next direction to go in. But it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of persistence. The WAIS meeting, I'll say, has been instrumental in pushing things in these directions more than once, both Thwaites Glacier, but also before that, the Pine Island Glacier study. And we had a lot to do with, as Robin pointed out, the IPY initiative and contributing to the glaciological aspects of that. I think the other challenge, or the other thing that we can do right now, and this meeting is really designed to support that, but it still takes a lot of work, is to have the different components of science work together and actually solve an issue that either has a geographic focus or a process focus. So I'm thinking of Thwaites Glacier, a geographic focus, but to have the results of Thor and the results of Ghost, these various projects that are studying different parts of the beast, actually work together in a paper or perhaps a short series of papers that pull together the ideas and the discoveries and describe the system, how it's going to evolve, how it has evolved in the recent past, in somewhat more detail, a little bit more granularity. That's the kind of thing that should lead to more actionable forecasts in terms of sea level rise from the region.
So I have a question for the earlier half of the panel members. So there's this focus on the productivity of the waters in front of all of these outlet glaciers, and I'm curious of how sensitive they are to these meltwater pulses that are potentially coming out of subglacial channels. And in addition to understanding the health and productivity of these communities, could this be used to better understand the subglacial discharge of waters and what that looks like?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I mentioned that I'm really worried about. And the idea that it's an interconnected system, say subglacial lake discharge events could on some time scale lead to changes in the primary production out in the open ocean. That's fascinating to me that there could be some linkage there. And that's one of the things that I think needs a lot of study on.
Yeah, just to add a sense that I'm really glad that Artemis has been funded and is kind of related, linked up with the ITGC effort. It was a part that we were missing, was the biological, the biogeochemical aspects of that region.
I'll add to that, we didn't really look at subglacial lakes. We're trying to look at steady state configurations, but at least the discharge estimates from the Smith 2017 paper of subglacial lake drainage events under Thwaites were about 2 to 3 times what our subglacial channels are already outputting on an average basis. So definitely would probably increase productivity in some regard, I would imagine.
Yeah, I can just add, I think this kind of constraining the impacts of the subglacial drainage events, the subglacial ecosystem, that's super important. I appreciated that you pointed that out because I find that fascinating, and it's, I think it's a really difficult thing to study also, and that's why maybe we don't know quite as much. But for example, the biogeochemical oceanographers, we can't use our typical methods to sample these types of things. You kind of have to, ideally you need to get down into the ice cavity and get samples, especially for reactive things like iron that gets stripped out of the water very quickly. It's super reactive, changes phase, and it's really hard to identify sources if you're not sampling right at the source. So I think that's something that is developing and is really exciting, and all these new ROV techniques and drilling through the ice shelf, that's all really exciting, and I think that'll be really helpful to these questions.
All right, we have a question from Emma Smith online. Emma, did you want to ask Alex your question?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me? Hopefully you can hear me okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask it. Yeah, so my question was really about the radar data and dividing specularity in quite a binary way. Is that easy to do, or was there a real range of different specularity values? And if so, do you think they could be indicative of a wide variety of different subglacial hydrological systems?
Yeah, great question, because that was actually one of the more difficult aspects, was figuring out how best to compare our model with the observations, especially because specularity is not necessarily a binary thing. So we basically just created a range of thresholds of kind of where it transitioned from what we would kind of subjectively deem as low specularity to high specularity. So we created a lot of, I think maybe 10 to 12 different masks of different thresholds, so made it a bunch of different binary maps, and then did the same thing for our model of different thresholds for where our model would predict these water-saturated regions to be. And then we compared each of those masks together, so there'd be, I think, like close to 70 different combinations of masks. And then as long as our model matched specularity in just one of those combinations, we deemed it a success. So we were trying to be kind of as generous as possible in that combination to keep our options open. But we did the binary comparison just because we were trying to keep just looking at broad scale patterns, and we didn't want to kind of overinterpret all the different nuances of specularity data.
Hi. Thanks everyone in this session for a great set of talks and kind of exposing some of the puzzle pieces that we're trying to link together. I have a question for Robin and maybe Kirsty, and I would also like to hear Asmara's thoughts on this, and as well as Ted's. Everyone has kind of touched on we're starting to look at these systems from a lot of different angles with modern observations and paleo data and fitting those into models. But I'm wondering, from kind of the senior folks in the crowd, how do you facilitate linking those things together? And is this Rings initiative somewhere that we could potentially facilitate those discussions? And then, especially from Asmara, one of the great early career people in our community, do you have any ideas of how we can do this as a future leader?
Maybe I'll let Kirsty answer the role rings could play in bringing together basically the observations past, present, and different ways to do that.
I'm here. Can you see that I've showed up? So yeah, that's exactly the kind of question that was the rings action group is asking, that it's necessary that not one group tries to solve Antarctica. And so to come together and identify what the most impactful observations that we can make would be by looking at where there are uncertainties in models, and then looking around the map of Antarctica and going, which nations have resources there that we can actually get this done, but that it's much more efficient and cohesive. So I think SCAR action groups are pretty well defined. They're fixed term. They've got an output, a question to answer, and this question is, well, what do we need to do and how are we going to do it? And so it would be really great to use that as a forum to have people contributing their questions and their possible answers. It's not there's no money in it, but it pushes the questions forwards, and it's how these things get started.
Okay, here it comes. I mean, Asmara, the speaker, the questioner asked a couple of times if you wanted a comment on how to integrate or what the situation looked like from you. Do you want to take this on?
Sure. I guess for me, part of it is I also want to know how my data can help with these models, and that's why I'm here presenting today. And I am actually really looking forward to, I think it's in 2 weeks, we're having a meeting, ITGC-wide meeting, and this is where I would like to ask questions from our colleagues of how I can, I guess, provide better information and ask the right questions, right, with what I have available. Yeah, I guess I'll hand it over to you, Ted, if you have other things to add.
I think, is this on now? I think actually your talk was a good start on all of that, in that you sort of integrated quite a bit of the oceanography and the sediment work together, and that's two big parts, and kind of approach the grounding line work from that side. And that's the kind of perspective on the problem. You know, we're all asked to get into more detail as science goes forward because the advance of science means that we can get into more detail. But it takes a lot of extra energy to look across the rest of the field and the other recent results, integrate them into your work, and describe the system more holistically. And so that's really going to be a focus for ITGC for the second half of its funding. I say second half, and I think Paul Cutler and NERC have recognized that the COVID issue means that we'll probably be going for at least a couple more years with some funding to actually achieve these sorts of multidisciplinary synthesis type studies at the end of ITGC.
And I think there might be, one other idea just to put on the table about how we get all these wonderful, amazing observations we've been hearing about the processes and the history, is I think we might begin to look a little bit more towards the modeling communities, other than the ice sheet modeling communities, that are a little more advanced in terms of data integration and data assimilation. And I'm really impressed, say the GitHub work out of Buffalo is starting to provide a place to share material. And what are the things that we can take from the atmospheric and ocean modeling community that we can bring more tightly into the ice sheet modeling community? And what lessons there? I feel like that's an avenue we haven't pushed very hard. I know that Dave Porter and Kirsty Tinto and Atsu put together a very interesting concept on how to, that we heard about this today, that really is about how do we build on what they've done in terms of vegetation classes. So that makes me think there are other lessons we need to learn about data and simulation and bridging that.
If I can add, yeah, I agree. A lot of studies that are funded to understand processes, interesting processes anywhere in the ice sheet or the ocean or whatever, they've discovered something and then they say, and this feeds into modeling studies without actually building that connection. In other words, hey, we found this, you guys should put it in your model. And there's a lot more work that's involved, and also there's a lot of perspective that's needed as to what additional processes are going to lead to the best improvement in a model. You may find something that's interesting that needs description, but in something with a focus towards forecasting sea level rise or perhaps the evolution of ecosystem may not be all that important. And so we say these things, process study, here you go modelers. There's work involved in making that happen. And also, as I said, some perspective and some, which ones are we going to work on to incorporate in more detail.
Great, our next question is going to come from online from Peter Washam. Here's the question for Mike.
Hey, Mike, great talk. So I just signed in sort of in the middle of your talk, if I'm right. But my question was, in your model, do you consider freeze-on from supercooling? Because that might be a sink or a temporary sink of this iron until that marine ice later melts.
Sort of. We do have freeze-on in the ice shelf thermodynamics. We don't have frazzle ice in the column, but if you do get a plume that's, rises up in a water column along the base of the ice shelf and it's below the pressure freezing point where it's at, you will get freeze-on. But for the ice melt water concentration part of the dissolved iron, we don't take that out. We just only flux in melt water where it's melting. We don't flux it out where there's freeze-on. So that is something to think about, because we could do it.
Okay, and I guess a lead on would be if you have these subglacial outflow regions, that's probably going to lead to freeze-on in cold cavities, but maybe not so much in warm cavities. So a potential interesting question would be like, where do you focus your measurements or your modeling to try and figure out the connection between the upstream outflow and the downstream in the ocean productivity?
Yeah, definitely. For example, Amory's got huge areas of freeze-on ice, and in the Ross there's some areas on it. And we, like I said, we do get some of that in the model from the physics side, but we haven't really been thinking about it in terms of the biogeochemistry yet.
I only have time for one question. I have two, but Alex, I was wondering, you talked about overestimation in the models towards the end of your talk. I was wondering if you knew about how much that has an effect on the projections, that year of a more accurate like channeling, how much that's affecting the projections.
Projections of like ice mass loss.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that we are hoping to look into because the MOLI has the ability to couple it with an ice dynamics model. So we've been talking about running, doing another project where we do various effective pressure parameterizations as well as a subglacial hydrology model coupled to the ice dynamics and seeing how that affects retreat, but that would be a separate project. So stay tuned.
All right, so that is our time for the discussion. We still had quite a few people who wanted to ask questions, so definitely ask people offline. We're going to move to coffee break. To close up, I'd like to give everyone a round of applause again who spoke today.